The Premier of my province, Jason Kenney, is in Ottawa today asking for money from the federal government. Specifically, he wants $2.4 billion from what they call the Federal Fiscal Stabilization Program. This program provides support to provinces facing extraordinary revenue declines, either a decline in non-resource revenue of 5% or more year over year, or a decline in resource revenue of 50% or more. Sadly, Alberta has met both of those benchmarks several times since the global price of oil collapsed in 2014. Like most Albertans, we at the AFL understand the gravity of the situation. Literally thousands of our members have lost their jobs, especially in oil and gas-related construction and manufacturing. We also feel very strongly that the federal government has a responsibility to step up and do more for oil and gas provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan. But despite those feelings, today I am asking the Prime Minister to say no to Jason Kenney's demands, at least without attaching a few strings. Why are we asking the federal government to qualify its support for our province? Well, for one thing, we want to make sure that the federal money isn't used by the UCP to subsidize more tax cuts for profitable corporations at the expense of our public services. We fear, yeah, feel free to clap. And to be clear, we fear that's exactly what will happen if the federal government gives Jason Kenney a blank check. We also think that the federal government should make the money that it gives to Alberta contingent on the Alberta government addressing the real problems facing our province, as opposed to manufactured boogeymen like the so-called foreign-funded campaign to landlock our oil, which is a story that Premier Kenney has been using to distract and inflame Albertans for months now. The first real problem that the federal government should require Premier Kenney to address is our broken revenue system. For decades now, Alberta has had a tax system that only raises enough money to cover between 70% and 80% of the true cost of our public services and public infrastructure. The rest has been funded by one-time windfall royalty revenue from our resources. In other words, instead of saving money that we earn from the development of our publicly owned resources, we've spent it, literally all of it, to give our citizens the impression that we can have Canadian standard services without paying Canadian standard taxes. The biggest beneficiaries of this approach have been, big surprise, corporations and the wealthy. That is why former Alberta Premier Ralph Klein called the Alberta Advantage. High quality services, low taxes. It was always a mirage. It was always a lie. It was a political sleight of hand. It was also never sustainable. And in an economic environment in which oil prices won't just be lower for longer, they'll probably be lower forever, it is the definition of insanity. The question for the federal government, as they receive Jason Kenney and his very large entourage of hangers-on, should be this: why should the rest of Canada help Alberta maintain an irresponsibly low level of taxes for corporations and the wealthy? Our answer from the Alberta Labour Movement is simple: they shouldn't, period. The second real problem that Alberta needs to help us with, the second real problem that Ottawa needs to help us with, has to do with the subject that we're talking about today, just transition. The fact is that the global oil and gas sector is being transformed by markets, by technology, and by concerns about climate change. In our heart of hearts, Albertans understand this. We understand that the boom is not coming back. What we really, really need, is for the rest of the country to help us prepare for a future that is not going to look like our past. That's the kind of help that Alberta needs from Ottawa and from other provinces in this confederation. not a blank check that will help Jason Kenney and his cohorts pursue an ideological agenda that doesn't really help our province. So that brings us back to Premier Kenney and his trip to Ottawa. The federal government currently sends three big streams of revenue to the provinces. One is the fiscal stabilization program that I already mentioned. The second is the so-called Canada Health and Social Transfer, which funds Ottawa's share of Medicare and other social programs. And the third is the much maligned and much misunderstood equalization program that uses federal tax revenue to make sure that all provinces can provide similar levels of services to all Canadians, regardless of where they live. Today, on behalf of the Alberta Labour Movement, I'm suggesting that instead of giving Jason Kenney's UCP what they want, the federal government should give our province what it really needs. And what we need is concrete, sustained, and substantial help with the unfolding transition away from fossil fuels and towards a greener economy. Specifically, instead of tweaking any of the three existing streams of cash going from Ottawa to the provinces, we suggest that the federal government create a fourth stream, explicitly designed to support a just transition. This new stream, which could be called the Just Transition Transfer, would help all provinces reach their carbon reduction targets, but it would be explicitly designed to give the lion's share of support to Canada's oil and gas producing provinces. Why? Because when it comes to taking action on the climate emergency, the fact is that some provinces, particularly Alberta, and to a slightly lesser extent Saskatchewan, are going to have to do more heavy lifting to reduce Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. The transition will be more challenging and disruptive in my province and in Saskatchewan. And to understand the reality of that statement, just look at the numbers. Alberta has about 12% of Canada's population. But because the oil and gas sector is such a big engine of our economy, we produce about 40% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. 12% of the population, 40% of our country's emissions. Climate action in provinces like Manitoba and British Columbia is going to be a big task. I don't want to underestimate that. But it won't require a fundamental reconfiguration of the province's industrial and employment makeup. The same is not true in provinces like Alberta. So instead of revising the equalization formula or tweaking the stabilization fund, what we're proposing is the creation of a new federal transfer to provinces linked specifically to climate action and just transition. This transfer program could fund both job-creating green infrastructure projects and training and apprenticeships, and most significantly, instead of driving the country apart, as is the case with the current state of the debate, it could represent a new way to renew Confederation while rising to the climate change challenge. The annual amount of the total transfer would be subject to negotiation, but it should be large because the challenge is large. Large enough to signify that we're putting our money where our mouth is and to show the country that we're ready to treat the climate crisis as the existential threat that it is. What we're talking about is something in the range of $10 to $20 billion a year, perhaps more. Importantly, we think the transfer's distribution should be based on a formula linked to recent GHG emissions in each province, but fixed from that point forward so that it doesn't perversely incentivize continued high GHGs. What that means is that if Alberta is currently responsible for about 40% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, it would receive about 40% of the new transfer money. Alternately, the formula could be linked to how many people are currently employed in oil and gas. Again, the bulk of support would go to the regions where the money is most needed. But here's the catch. The federal government should not simply hand the money over to provincial governments. Instead, we should establish new just transition agencies, one in each province, jointly governed by the federal government, the provincial government, local governments, along with representatives from labor, business, the Indigenous community, and civil society. This would ensure the transfer money isn't simply absorbed into provincial budgets as general revenue or used to displace other infrastructure or training funds. It would ensure the money is used for the intended purpose. There are already models of joint governance structures like this, like the port authorities on our coasts. We might also want to require provincial co-governance to be linked to cost-shared contributions. We can all easily imagine a long list of worthwhile infrastructure and training and apprenticeship projects that this transfer money could fund: public transit expansion, building retrofits, renewable energy projects in Alberta and Saskatchewan, oil well reclamation, electric charging infrastructure, methane capture, high-speed rail, the list goes on. The key would be that the just transition transfer would provide real dollars for actual transition and actual new jobs, not vague assurances that jobs will materialize for displaced workers sometime, somewhere in an imagined future. The transfer should also include a good jobs guarantee for current energy workers. People who are losing their jobs need to be given a guarantee of new employment funded by the transfer, and there should be other conditions tied to the transfer as well, like ending fossil fuel subsidies, like minimum apprenticeships for women and Indigenous people, and like minimum royalty rates so that cut rate royalties don't act as a de facto subsidy for fossil fuel companies. Finally, and of course, the transfer should be tied to demonstrated reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. It makes little sense to fund climate action if the province is engaged in activities that simultaneously increase emissions. Potentially, the funding for such a program could be drawn mainly from ending tax loopholes for corporations and subsidies for oil and gas companies. In essence, the oil and gas industry itself would contribute a lion's share of the cost for this necessary transition. In conclusion, I just want to say this. There is currently a lot of bad blood in our confederation between oil-producing provinces, like my own, and oil-consuming provinces. The oil-consuming provinces say, we need to deal with climate change, and they're right. But the oil-producing provinces say, easy for you to say, it's not your job on the line. The just transition transfer that we are recommending would help bridge that gap. It would be a concrete, tangible way for the rest of Canada to say to Alberta, we know that we're asking a lot of you. In fact, we know we're asking you to do more than the rest of us. We understand and respect that, and that's why we're going to show our respect and our understanding by digging deep and helping to fund the transition for you and your families. That's the heart of the concept of the just transition. No community or group of workers should bear a disproportionate share of the cost or the pain of the transition. Climate change is an existential threat, not only to our provinces and our country, but indeed to all of humanity, a threat that cannot be ignored, but we also need to recognize how hard this will be, particularly for some regions and for some groups of workers. And we need to approach this task with compassion, understanding, and a willingness to provide support. We are currently at a crossroads in our country. One road leads towards climate failure and a divided country, and the other towards a more sustainable economy and a united country. For the sake of all Canadians and our children and our grandchildren, on behalf of the working people of Alberta, I am urging our leaders at both the provincial and federal levels to take the second road. That requires that the rest of Canada show Alberta much more compassion and solidarity, it also requires the federal government giving Jason Kenney what Alberta really needs, not what he's asking for. Thank you.